My name is Miss Marple. Welcome to my new case.
The morning air was crisp as the sun barely crested the horizon, casting a faint golden sheen over the tidy lanes of the quiet neighborhood where Rex Fortescue lived. There was a peculiar calm, almost oppressive in its stillness, as if the day itself were holding its breath. Inside the Fortescue office, the ordinary hum of business was conspicuously absent. The polished wood of the desk gleamed in the dim light, yet it bore a shadow that hinted at something far more sinister than the calm exterior suggested. Rex Fortescue, the man known for his commanding presence and keen business acumen, lay sprawled across the carpet, motionless. The first visitor to stumble upon the scene was a junior clerk, whose startled cry echoed down the hallway. Panic fluttered through the household like an unwelcome guest, disturbing the routine of servants and staff who had long grown accustomed to the meticulous rhythm of the Fortescue estate. Within moments, the household was a flurry of activity, phones ringing, doors slamming, servants rushing to fetch help, and neighbors casting nervous glances through the tall windows. Yet amid the chaos, the peculiar detail that would puzzle everyone for days remained. Scattered around Rex's pockets were tiny grains of rye, glinting faintly under the rising sun, almost as if mocking the seriousness of the scene. Detective Inspector Neal arrived promptly, his sharp eyes taking in the tableau with practiced detachment, but even he, seasoned though he was in the investigation of human folly and malice, could not immediately ignore the oddity of the grains. They seemed trivial, almost laughable, and yet there was a deliberate precision in their placement that hinted at an unseen hand behind the tragedy. Miss Marple, who had been quietly observing from the periphery, her keen eyes missing nothing, noticed the subtle cues that others overlooked. The way a chair had been slightly pulled back, the faint scuff marks on the rug, and most tellingly, the expression of quiet horror frozen on Rex's features. It was not merely the physical circumstances of his death that spoke to her. It was the underlying rhythm of human behavior, the invisible threads that connected each member of the household to this fateful morning. She knew instinctively that the killer was not a stranger, for such acts of intimate precision required knowledge, familiarity, and a chilling patience. Yet at that very moment, no one could have guessed the lengths to which greed, jealousy, and carefully hidden resentments could drive a person. The family gathered shortly thereafter, their faces etched with shock, grief, and an undercurrent of tension that only Miss Marple could perceive in its full complexity. Lancelot, the eldest son, tried to maintain an air of composure, yet the slight tremor in his voice betrayed his anxiety. Brenda, the younger daughter, seemed almost detached, her eyes reflecting a mixture of fear and calculation. Giles, the middle son, shifted uneasily, his hands clasped tightly as though the simple act of holding them together could steady the storm within. Each of them, Miss Marple noted silently, had a carefully constructed facade, but beneath it lay a web of desires, ambitions, and potentially motives. The servants, too, were conspicuously alert, some out of loyalty, others out of fear, and still others out of curiosity that masked deeper knowledge. As the initial inquiries began, the focus naturally turned toward Rex Fortescue's recent dealings. There had been a series of unusually large transactions, some flagged internally as irregular. Miss Marple's mind, ever attentive to subtle inconsistencies, picked up on patterns that might have seemed trivial to others. The documents strewn across the desk, the ledger left open to a particular page, and the faint scent of tobacco all hinted at matters that were far from ordinary. It was in these overlooked details that the first threads of a larger story began to emerge, a story that wove together ambition, avarice, and a meticulous plan executed with the precision of someone who understood the vulnerabilities of human nature intimately. Outside, the day progressed with deceptive normality. The sun climbed higher, casting elongated shadows across the manicured lawns, yet within the walls of the Fortescue estate, an invisible tension thickened the air. Miss Marple's gaze moved over each family member and servant, noting subtle gestures, a foot tapping, a hand nervously brushing a lock of hair, the way eyes flickered toward another before darting away. Such details, insignificant to the casual observer, formed a silent dialogue, an unspoken confession that only someone attuned to human behavior could interpret. It was becoming increasingly clear to her that this was not a crime of impulse. Someone had planned every aspect of Rex Fortescue's demise, down to the most inconspicuous elements, such as the rye grains that would ultimately prove symbolic in ways the family could not yet understand. By midday, the formal investigation had taken root. Inspector Neal questioned the household staff methodically, while Miss Marple moved quietly among them, her mind piecing together invisible connections. The cook recalled peculiar instructions given the night before. The housemaid mentioned overheard arguments, and even the gardener provided insights that seemed at first irrelevant, yet under Miss Marple's scrutiny, formed a pattern both intricate and chilling. She understood that human motives often masqueraded as trivialities, small irritations, old grudges, financial desires. But when combined in the right proportions, they could lead to acts of calculated violence, and so, as the sun dipped slightly, casting long shadows through the office windows, Miss Marple stood silently at the threshold, considering the scene before her. She knew that the murder of Rex Fortescue was merely the opening act of a story yet to unfold, one that would reveal not only the depth of human greed, but also the extraordinary lengths to which someone would go to fulfill it. The rye grains, innocuous to the untrained eye, were a deliberate signature, a message in miniature, signaling that the next moves, if observed carefully, could be anticipated. As she turned to survey the room one final time, she felt the familiar stirrings of that quiet certainty which had guided her through many dark corridors of human behavior. The understanding that nothing in human nature was ever truly hidden from the observant eye. The morning after Rex Fortescue's death dawned with an uncanny stillness. The world outside the Fortescue estate seemed indifferent, the birds chirping, the gardeners resuming their duties. Yet within those tall, stately walls, a tension coiled beneath the calm. Every sound, a door creaking open, footsteps on the gravel, the distant chime of the grandfather clock seemed sharper, heavier. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for the next inevitable disturbance. Inspector Neal had returned early. His manner was composed but purposeful, and his mind, already restless, began sorting through the fragments of the previous day's discoveries. The rye grains still puzzled him, more as an irritation than a clue. Something too absurd, too childlike to belong to a deliberate murder. Yet he had learned through hard experience that absurdity often masked the most calculated kind of wickedness. Miss Marple, meanwhile, had chosen a quiet corner of the drawing room from which she could observe without intrusion. Her knitting needles clicked softly, a rhythm as calm as her expression, though her thoughts moved far more quickly than her hands. She watched as the members of the household drifted in and out of the room, each of them carrying a particular heaviness in their movements. The weight of fear disguised as fatigue. Mrs. Adele Fortescue, Rex's much younger second wife, entered first. Her face was pale, her eyes swollen but not from grief. Miss Marple recognized the expression of a woman measuring her words before she spoke them. Adele sank into the armchair nearest the fireplace, glancing toward the inspector with a tremor in her hands that seemed as much deliberate as genuine. Her voice when she spoke was soft, almost melodic. "I still can't believe it," she murmured. "He wasn't ill." "Not really." "How could something like this happen?" Inspector Neal's tone was measured, polite but probing. "We're still waiting for the post-mortem results, Mrs. Fortescue. But I should tell you there are certain peculiarities." Her eyes flickered for the briefest moment. "Peculiarities?" "The rye, for instance," Neal replied. "Found in his pocket. Does that mean anything to you?" Adele shook her head too quickly. "Rye, like the grain?" "Yes, about a handful of it." "Odd, isn't it?" She looked down, feigning confusion, but Miss Marple saw something shift behind her expression. A flicker of alarm or memory, quickly masked. It was subtle, fleeting, but enough to catch the older woman's attention. Miss Marple tucked the observation away silently, as she always did, a thread she knew would matter later. The inspector continued his questioning, moving from Adele to the servants. The butler, Crump, was a man of impeccable composure, though even he could not completely disguise the nervous twitch of his left hand. The housemaid, Gladys, was young and earnest, her voice trembling as she recounted finding her employer's body. Each story aligned with the others on the surface, yet Miss Marple could feel small inconsistencies pressing against the edges, tiny distortions of truth that hinted at something far more complex. When the inspector stepped away to make a telephone call, Miss Marple rose from her chair and wandered toward the window, her gaze falling upon the sprawling gardens outside. The wind brushed softly through the hedges, bending the tall grass into fleeting patterns that disappeared as soon as they formed. She thought, not for the first time, how easily lives could appear so ordered, so proper, and yet hide such disquiet beneath the surface. She turned as she heard footsteps, Lancelot Fortescue entering the room. His face bore none of the sorrow one might expect of a grieving son. Instead, there was calculation in his eyes, a certain impatience, as if the practical matters of death, the will, the estate, the endless inquiries were distractions from something more important to him. "Miss Marple, isn't it?" he said, extending a hand that felt perfunctory. "I hear you've taken an interest in our little domestic tragedy." She smiled faintly. "Interest, yes. Tragedy, most certainly. I often find, Mr. Fortescue, that when terrible things happen in households such as yours, it's not the events themselves that are surprising, but rather how long they've been quietly brewing." He gave a short, humorless laugh. "You sound as though you think we've been expecting it." "Not expecting," she said, her tone light but firm. "Merely preparing, perhaps, in ways one doesn't even realize." Lancelot frowned, studying her for a moment. "You've got a rather unsettling way of putting things, Miss Marple." "It's an unsettling business," she replied simply, returning to her knitting. When he left, the silence that followed felt almost deliberate, as though the house itself exhaled in relief. Miss Marple considered his manner, controlled, efficient, but edged with frustration. There was something in him that did not align with the role of a morning sun, and yet she reminded herself grief manifests in many forms. Still, she could not dismiss the feeling that Lancelot's interest in his father's death was not purely emotional. By late afternoon, Inspector Neal had compiled a growing list of observations. The toxicologist's report confirmed his suspicion. Rex Fortescue had been poisoned. The substance, though still to be identified precisely, bore traces of a bitter almond scent. Cyanide, perhaps, or something derived from it. The inspector shared this revelation with Miss Marple as the light dimmed through the windows, casting the room in a soft golden haze. "Poison," she said quietly, not surprised. "Such an intimate method. So very English, don't you think?" Neal gave a small grunt. "You sound as though you've seen this before." "Oh, I've seen many things," she replied, her gaze distant. "But what interests me is not how it was done, it's why. People don't poison for sport. It's always personal. Always." The inspector studied her, uncertain whether to be amused or uneasy. "You think this is personal, then? A family affair?" "I think," Miss Marple said softly, "that whoever placed those grains of rye in his pocket wanted us to notice them, which means they're not just a symbol, they're a message. And that message was meant for someone in this house." Night had fallen by the time she returned to her small cottage, the path lit by the faint glow of the moon. She walked slowly, her thoughts aligning in quiet patterns. The rhyme surfaced again in her mind, the one that had haunted her since she first heard of the rye. Sing a song of sixpence, a pocket full of rye. The absurdity of it, she knew, was exactly what made it brilliant. Whoever the murderer was, they were clever. Clever enough to turn something childish into something chillingly precise. Miss Marple paused at her gate, her hand resting on the latch. She could feel it now, the faint tremor in the air that came just before a storm broke. One murder was never quite enough for a mind that took such satisfaction in its own cleverness. And somewhere within that grand, uneasy house, someone was already planning their next move. The next morning broke under a pale, uncertain light, as though the sun itself hesitated to rise over the house where suspicion lingered like fog. Inside the Fortescue estate, the hush that had settled overnight deepened into a kind of strained quiet, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards, or the subdued murmur of servants going about their work. Even the air seemed thicker, touched by an unease that no open window could dispel. Miss Marple sat by the kitchen hearth, a teacup cradled between her hands, her expression calm, but her eyes thoughtful. She had come early, invited by Inspector Neal, who had found her observations the previous day both disconcerting and, if he were honest with himself, useful. The post-mortem results had confirmed what they both already suspected: poison, and a cleverly administered one. Yet the question of who remained a puzzle as intricate as lacework. "Everyone has a story," Miss Marple said softly. as if speaking to herself. And in every story there's always one sentence that doesn't quite fit. Inspector Neal, standing by the window, glanced at her. "And which sentence is that in this one?" "Oh, I don't know yet," she admitted, her tone almost cheerful. "But it's there, hidden somewhere between what's said and what's carefully avoided." Neal frowned, not entirely comfortable with her quiet certainty. "We'll see what the morning brings. Lancelot Fortescue's due back from town, and we'll need to go through the accounts. There's talk that Rex was involved in some rather dubious business arrangements." Miss Marple nodded. "Money, then. Always a reliable motive, though I've found it's rarely the only one." A movement in the hallway caught their attention. Gladys, the young maid, lingered just outside the doorway. Her face was pale, her eyes downcast. Miss Marple watched her closely, noting the stiffness in her shoulders, the way her hands fidgeted against her apron. There was fear there, but also something else. Remorse, perhaps, or the burden of a secret too heavy for someone so young. "Come in, my dear," Miss Marple said gently. "You look as though you've seen a ghost." Gladys hesitated, then stepped inside. I didn't mean to eavesdrop, ma'am. There's something I should tell someone." Inspector Neal gestured for her to sit, but she remained standing, wringing her hands. "It's about Mr. Fortescue," she said. "The day before he died, he told me to bring him his tea in the study, same as always. But when I went in, he was on the telephone, angry, shouting at someone. He said, 'You'll regret this, I promise you.' And then he saw me and stopped talking. He looked strange." Miss Marple leaned forward. "Strange in what way, dear?" Gladys bit her lip, as if he were frightened. And then he told me to leave the tray and go. He never said who he was talking to. The inspector scribbled a note, though Miss Marple could tell his mind was already running ahead. "Did you hear anything else?" "No, sir. Only that when I came back later to fetch the tray, there was a smell in the room, like almonds. I thought it was from his tobacco, maybe. I didn't think anything of it then." Miss Marple's eyes met Neal's. Neither spoke, but the shared understanding hung between them, the unmistakable scent of cyanide. After Gladys left, Miss Marple rose and wandered toward the window, her mind moving through the pieces of what she'd heard. A man like Rex Fortescue, she thought, did not make enemies lightly, but when he did, they were rarely the kind to forgive. His death, then, was not born of impulse but design, and the design had threads reaching back farther than anyone yet realized. By midday, the household had gathered again, tense, restless, every face a portrait of something half-hidden. The family sat in the drawing room, waiting for the inspector to begin his questioning. Lancelot had arrived from town, brisk and efficient, his presence immediately altering the atmosphere. He greeted his stepmother with a cool nod and his siblings with perfunctory civility. "Let's not waste time, Inspector," he said. "You're here to find out who killed my father, and I'm just as eager to know as you are." "Then perhaps you'll start by telling me about your father's business," Neal replied. "There are some irregularities that suggest he was involved in, shall we say, risky ventures." Lancelot hesitated, then sighed. Father had a reputation for ruthlessness. He liked to gamble with people's fortunes, not just his own. Mining, foreign investments, even a few questionable loans. It's entirely possible he crossed someone dangerous. Miss Marple, quietly knitting at the corner of the room, spoke without looking up. And yet those dealings would hardly explain the rye, would they? Lancelot turned toward her, surprised. "Rye? Yes," she said. "The grains found in his pocket. A detail one might dismiss, but not if one knew the rhyme." He gave a faint, puzzled smile. "The rhyme?" She looked up then, her expression mild. "Sing a song of sixpence, a pocket full of rye. It's curious, don't you think? The sort of clue that only someone very certain of their cleverness would leave behind." A silence followed, broken only by the faint crackle of the fire. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, but she felt the shift in the room, the uneasy glances exchanged, the quickened breaths. She had struck something, though she could not yet tell whose nerves had been touched. As evening approached, the inspector received word from the laboratory. The poison used was indeed cyanide, administered through the tea. But the teapot had been washed clean by the time it was found, as though someone had taken care to remove the evidence. The question now was simple but deadly. Who had served that tea? When confronted, the kitchen staff insisted the pot had been handled only by the maid, Gladys. Yet Gladys, trembling, insisted she had merely followed instructions from Mrs. Fortescue herself. Adele's denial was swift, too swift perhaps. The air in the room thickened as accusation met defense, and beneath it all Miss Marple sat silently, watching. She noticed the way Adele's fingers tightened around the edge of her handkerchief, how her voice trembled only when she insisted on her innocence. But she also saw something else, the way Gladys avoided her gaze, as though haunted by something she couldn't yet confess. Later, as the household began to retire, Miss Marple lingered by the staircase, listening to the faint murmur of voices behind closed doors. She could feel the pattern forming, faint but certain, like stitches tightening on a piece of fabric. Someone in this house was weaving lies with careful precision, and before long the thread would begin to unravel. She returned to her room, the moonlight spilling across her open notebook. On the first page, in neat looping handwriting, she had written a single line: "The blackbird sings before the pie is opened." Beneath it she added a thought, simple, almost whimsical, but to her profoundly telling: "There will be another death before this rhyme is done." The morning that followed was heavy with the kind of silence that carries its own weight. The house, though awake, seemed reluctant to move. The servants whispered in corners, their eyes darting nervously toward every door as though expecting something or someone to emerge unexpectedly. Even the ticking of the clock in the hallway seemed louder than usual, a steady reminder that time was passing, though no one within the Fortescue estate quite knew what it might bring. Miss Marple rose early, her thoughts already weaving themselves into quiet order. The night had given her clarity, though not comfort. She had been right about one thing: the rhyme was not yet finished. The murder of Rex Fortescue was the first verse in a cruel, unfolding pattern. The realization didn't frighten her so much as it saddened her. The predictability of human wickedness, the way cleverness so often disguised itself as art. Inspector Neal had returned at dawn, looking more tired than he cared to admit. He found Miss Marple in the morning room, her teacup steaming faintly beside her as she examined the day's newspaper. She greeted him with that calm, almost grandmotherly composure that always made him feel both reassured and slightly out of his depth. "Another long night," she remarked without looking up. "Too long," he said, pulling a chair opposite her. "I've been going through the servant statements again. They all swear the tea was made in the usual way, same pot, same tray, same sugar bowl. Nothing out of place. Except for the poison," Miss Marple said mildly. "Except for that," he agreed. There was a pause. The faint rustle of the paper was the only sound between them. Finally she set it down and met his gaze. "You'll find that the next step isn't in the teapot, Inspector. It's in the will," he frowned. "The will?" "Of course. Death often clarifies such matters, doesn't it? When someone dies unexpectedly, everyone who stands to gain suddenly becomes very visible, especially those who try not to be." Neal leaned back in his chair. "You think it's about inheritance?" "I think," she said slowly, "that money is rarely the first reason for murder, but it's almost always the most convenient excuse." Before the inspector could reply, the sound of raised voices drifted from the corridor, Brenda and Lancelot, their argument sharp, brittle. It was the kind of quarrel born not of fresh grief but of old resentments forced suddenly into the light. Miss Marple listened quietly as their words cut through the air like thin blades. "You always think you know better, don't you?" Brenda snapped. "You've been gone for months and suddenly you come home to take charge, as if you even care what happens to any of us." "I care about the truth," Lancelot retorted. "And if you had any sense, you would too. You think I don't see what's going on here? The money, the will. Adele pretending she's the grieving widow while half the house whispers that she's to blame." Brenda's voice faltered, then steadied. "Maybe you should be careful what you say, Lance. Accusing people without proof, Father wouldn't have tolerated that." He laughed, short and cold. "Father tolerated a lot worse." The silence that followed was heavy, punctuated only by the soft click of a door closing. Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. Human tempers, she mused, were always most revealing when provoked. Later that morning, the family gathered in the study for the reading of Rex Fortescue's will. The solicitor, a cautious man with a habit of polishing his spectacles between every sentence, took his seat behind the desk. The atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. Miss Marple stood quietly by the fireplace, her presence tolerated more than invited. But she had long ago learned that people often ignored what they could not easily categorize. The reading began with the usual formalities: Small legacies to distant relatives, modest gifts to servants who had been in service for many years. Then came the real matter, the division of the estate. To my wife, Adele Fortescue, the solicitor read, I leave a life interest in my estate, to be held until her death or remarriage. Thereafter the principal estate is to pass equally to my children, Lancelot, Giles, and Brenda. Adele's face remained composed, but a faint tremor in her hand betrayed her. Lancelot's eyes narrowed slightly. Brenda sat rigid, staring down at her folded hands. Miss Marple saw the subtle shifts in posture, the quick glances, tells of emotions carefully restrained. When the solicitor finished, a strange quiet followed. It was not relief nor outrage, but something colder, calculation. Miss Marple could almost feel it, the ripple of thoughts moving through the room as each person measured what they had gained against what they might have hoped for. It was Giles who spoke first. So nothing changes. She keeps the house, the money, everything until she marries again. That's what it says, Lancelot murmured. And father always was one for conditions. Adele turned toward them, her voice steady but low. Do you both think I wanted this? That I asked for any of it? I never did. Miss Marple caught the flash of something sharp in her tone. Not guilt, but anger. Genuine perhaps, but misdirected. She stored it away for later consideration. When the gathering broke up, Miss Marple followed the solicitor quietly into the hall. Mr. Prescott, she said, you've handled the Fortescue affairs for some time, I gather. Yes, Miss Marple, nearly 20 years. Then you would know if Mr. Fortescue had made any recent changes to his will. He hesitated, glancing over his shoulder before lowering his voice. He did, as a matter of fact. Just last month. Before that, Adele's provision was much smaller, but he increased it quite generously, I might add. Curious, Miss Marple murmured. A sudden show of affection, do you think? Prescott gave a humorless smile. Rex Fortescue wasn't known for affection. No, I think it was guilt, or perhaps fear. Hard to tell which. Miss Marple thanked him and watched him leave, her thoughts spinning. A change in the will, recent, generous, inexplicable. Such changes rarely came without pressure. She thought again of the rhyme, of the cruel playfulness of it. Each element was a piece of something larger, and she could feel the shape beginning to emerge, though it remained just beyond full comprehension. That evening, as twilight crept across the sky, a scream shattered the fragile calm of the house. It came from upstairs, sharp and terrified. Miss Marple and Inspector Neal reached the landing almost at the same moment, the echo of footsteps and alarmed voices rising around them. Gladys, the young maid, was lying on the floor of her small room, motionless. Her face was pale, her eyes wide open but unseeing. Around her neck hung a small string of black beads, ordinary save for the way they glimmered faintly in the dim light. Miss Marple knelt beside her, her fingers steady as she examined the beads. Inspector, she said softly, I think our rhyme continues. He stared at her. What do you mean? Her gaze did not leave the girl's still form. The maid was in the garden hanging out the clothes. It seems the murderer has a fondness for poetry. For a long moment no one moved. The air in the narrow corridor was thick with the shock of what they were seeing. The faint scent of soap and lavender hung in the room, mingled now with the colder metallic tang of death. Gladys's body lay unnaturally still, her head tilted slightly to one side, her hands half curled as though she had tried, even in her last breath, to reach for something beyond her grasp. Miss Marple knelt beside her, her old hand steady, her eyes soft but unflinching. Inspector Neal stood just behind her, every nerve drawn taut. She's been dead only a few minutes, he murmured, glancing toward the open window. The wind stirred the curtains faintly, as though mocking the stillness inside. Whoever did this can't be far. Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. Her gaze had fallen upon the small cluster of black beads around Gladys's neck. They were ordinary enough at first glance, but their placement was deliberate, artful, a message. It's the rhyme again, she said at last, her voice barely above a whisper. The maid in the garden, and now the crow. Neal frowned. Crow? She gestured to the beads. Black as a crow's feathers. The murderer is still following the rhyme. Every death is another verse. There was a pause as her words sank in. The servants had gathered timidly at the door, their faces pale, eyes wide. Miss Marple looked up at them with quiet authority. Go back downstairs, all of you. There's nothing to be done here now. When the room was cleared, Inspector Neal moved closer, lowering his voice. You think this was planned all along? A pattern? Yes, Miss Marple said softly. Whoever is doing this isn't killing out of panic or opportunity. These deaths are being staged, he stared at her. But why? To make a point, she replied. Or perhaps simply to prove they can. Together they examined the small room. There were no signs of a struggle. No overturned furniture, no broken glass, only the faint impression of footsteps near the open window and the lingering trace of something faintly bitter in the air. Miss Marple inhaled, eyes narrowing. The same scent, she murmured. Cyanide again, I should think. The inspector nodded grimly. That would make 3 deaths connected by poison. 3, Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. And yet the rhyme still isn't finished. Later that afternoon, the household was gathered once more in the drawing room. The weight of Gladys's death had settled over them like a shroud. Even Adele, usually so poised, seemed shaken, her hands trembling as she poured herself a glass of water she did not drink. Brenda sat near the window, staring out into the garden with blank eyes, while Lancelot paced the floor, his movements sharp and restless. Inspector Neal stood before them, his tone measured. Miss Gladys Martin has been found dead. We believe she was poisoned. Until we know more, no one is to leave this house. A murmur rippled through the group. Shock, indignation, fear. Lancelot stopped pacing and looked up sharply. Are you suggesting one of us did this? I'm suggesting, Neal said evenly, that until I can rule anyone out, everyone is a suspect. Brenda's voice trembled. But why would anyone kill Gladys? She was only a servant. Miss Marple's gaze moved to her, kind but probing. Sometimes, my dear, servants see more than they should. Or hear what they were never meant to. Adele turned toward her sharply. You think she knew something? I think, Miss Marple said, that someone feared she did. The silence that followed was broken only by the faint crackling of the fire. Miss Marple could sense it again, the shifting tension between them, the invisible threads of suspicion binding each person to the other. It was no longer merely grief that filled the room, but something darker, more desperate. Fear had a way of loosening tongues, of revealing what people tried hardest to conceal. After the meeting dispersed, Miss Marple lingered by the hearth, her eyes following the flicker of the flames. She thought of Gladys, the bright, eager girl who had once confided in her during a village fete months ago. I want to do well, miss, she had said then, her voice soft and hopeful. I don't want to be like the others who stay servants forever. Miss Marple felt a quiet ache in her chest at the memory. That kind of hope was dangerous in a house built on secrets. Inspector Neal approached her, lowering his voice. You knew the girl? Yes, Miss Marple said quietly. I helped her find her first post. She was good-hearted but naive. Easily impressed, easily led. If someone had given her instructions, told her to do something without explaining why, she'd have done it without question. Then she might have been an accomplice without realizing it. Precisely, Miss Marple said. And once she began to suspect, she became a liability. The inspector exhaled slowly, rubbing his temples. It's all connected, the rye, the poison, the rhyme. But I can't see the hand behind it. Miss Marple's eyes softened. You will, Inspector. When you stop looking for cleverness and start looking for pride. He frowned. Pride? Yes. Whoever is doing this believes themselves clever beyond measure. They want to be admired for it. And that sort of vanity, she said gently, is always the thread that unravels the whole thing. That evening, as the light dimmed and the house fell into uneasy quiet, Miss Marple took a walk through the garden where Gladys had often worked. The roses were still in bloom, their fragrance sweet and cloying in the cool air. She paused near the drying line where freshly washed sheets fluttered faintly in the wind. Something caught her eye, a torn scrap of paper pinned beneath a stone almost hidden by the grass. She bent and picked it up, smoothing it gently between her fingers. The handwriting was hurried, childish, but familiar. I think I know who it is. I'll tell you tonight. Please don't say anything, no signature. But the message was unmistakably Gladys's. Miss Marple's heart quickened, not with fear, but with the steady certainty that she was closing in on something vital. Someone had discovered her secret before she could speak it aloud. She turned toward the house, its tall windows glowing faintly against the gathering dusk. Somewhere inside, the murderer moved freely, confident still, unaware that the pattern of their rhyme was beginning to betray them. Miss Marple folded the note carefully into her pocket and walked back toward the light. There was still one verse left to be played, and she meant to be there when it was sung. The night settled over Yew Tree Lodge with a stillness that felt almost deliberate, as though the house itself were holding its breath. The wind whispered through the tall yew hedges, brushing softly against the windows like a secret trying to get in. Miss Marple sat by the faint glow of a lamp in the small guest room, the note Gladys had written resting on the table before her. The words seemed to flicker in the light, fragile and desperate. She traced the edge of the paper with one finger, her mind turning over the meaning again and again. "I think I know who it is." Those words, she knew, had sealed the girl's fate. Whoever Gladys had suspected had been close enough, watchful enough to sense her growing fear. That meant the murderer wasn't acting blindly. They were alert, calculating, and far too comfortable inside this house. Downstairs, a faint creak echoed through the hall. Miss Marple listened, her head tilting slightly. It wasn't the heavy step of a man, nor the scurrying tread of a servant. It was lighter, slower, deliberate. Someone moving after hours, trying not to be heard. She waited until the sound faded before she rose quietly and opened her door. The corridor was dark except for the thin strip of moonlight spilling across the carpet. The smell of polish and old wood filled the air. Miss Marple moved softly, her slippers making no sound as she stepped into the hallway. She had learned long ago that silence could be the best disguise of all. At the top of the stairs, she paused. Below, she could just make out the shape of someone descending the main staircase, a shadow against the faint light from the hall lamp. The figure moved with precision, no hesitation, no wasted motion. Whoever it was, they knew exactly where they were going. She waited until the person reached the bottom before following at a distance, her steps feather-light. The figure crossed the hall toward the study door, the same room where Rex Fortescue's papers had been kept before the police sealed it off. The faint click of the latch sounded, then silence. Miss Marple hesitated only a moment before descending. Her hand brushed the banister, cool and smooth beneath her fingers. When she reached the bottom, she caught the faintest scent of something, violet, subtle but distinct. She recognized it at once. Only one person in the house used that perfume. She drew back before she was seen, retreating quietly into the shadows of the hall. A minute later, the study door opened again. The figure re-emerged, carrying something small in one hand. The lamplight caught a glint of metal, a key perhaps, and then the person disappeared toward the east wing. When the footsteps faded, Miss Marple stepped forward. She waited a beat, listening, then turned the study's handle and slipped inside. The air smelled faintly of dust and old paper. She lit a candle from the desk and held it close to the surface. The top drawer had been forced open, its contents disturbed. Documents were scattered in disarray as though someone had been searching in haste or staging the appearance of it. She bent closer, scanning the papers until one caught her eye, a torn half of a letter, its edges jagged where it had been ripped from the rest. The handwriting was familiar, Rex Fortescue's, looping and impatient. The few visible lines made her heart tighten. No choice left. "If you persist, you'll answer for it. The money must go back. I won't be ruined for your vanity." The remaining words trailed off into nothing, the rest missing. Miss Marple folded the scrap carefully into her handkerchief. Vanity. The word lingered in her mind. It was what she had told Inspector Neal before. Pride would be the undoing of the murderer. A sudden creak from the floorboards made her extinguish the candle instantly. The darkness swallowed her, but she stood motionless, listening. The sound came again, closer this time, from the corridor. Then the faintest whisper of a door closing. She waited several minutes before relighting the candle and slipping back into the hall. The silence felt heavier now, as though the house were aware of her movements. When she returned to her room, she locked the door, a rare precaution for her. Then she sat down again, her expression grave. She was certain of it now, the murderer was not finished. The rhyme still had verses left to play out, and if she could not stop them, someone else would die before morning. Sleep did not come easily. Her mind replayed the smallest details: Gladys's note, the perfume of violets, the torn letter, the secret midnight visit. The rhyme wound through her thoughts, a haunting melody threading each clue together. "Sing a song of sixpence, a pocket full of rye." By dawn she had her answer, or at least the shape of it. There was still evidence to be found, still threads to be pulled, but the pattern was forming clearly in her mind. All that remained was to prove it before the murderer realized how close she had come. The next morning, Inspector Neal arrived early, his expression weary but determined. "You were right," he said without preamble as Miss Marple joined him in the breakfast room. "The poison used on Gladys matches the one that killed Rex Fortescue. Cyanide. Same preparation, same delivery method." Miss Marple nodded. "I expected as much. And the night visitor?" He looked at her sharply. "You saw something?" "I saw someone," she said calmly. "But I'd rather not say who, not yet. You'll need proof, not speculation." "Then what do you suggest we do?" "Patience," she replied. "And a little play acting, perhaps. Let the murderer believe they are safe. Pride will do the rest." He studied her, then gave a small nod. "You're a remarkable woman, Miss Marple," she smiled faintly. "Oh, not remarkable at all, Inspector. Simply old enough to recognize the patterns people leave behind." Outside, the sun broke through the clouds, spilling pale gold across the garden. The roses glistened with dew, their beauty almost mocking in the face of what the house still held within its walls. Miss Marple rose from her chair and looked toward the window, her reflection faint in the glass. Somewhere in this house, she thought the murderer was watching too, perhaps even smiling at their own cleverness. But cleverness, she knew, had a way of unraveling at the smallest tug, and she intended to find that loose thread before the rhyme claimed another victim. The day unfolded with an almost deliberate calm, as though the house itself were conspiring to hide the chaos beneath its polished surface. Servants moved with muted efficiency, eyes downcast, voices hushed. Breakfast was served on time, the silver gleaming, the linen uncreased. Only the tension in the air betrayed that the ordinary rhythms of life at Yew Tree Lodge had been irrevocably broken. Miss Marple sat quietly at the end of the long dining table, a cup of weak tea cooling before her. Her gaze moved from one face to another, reading the subtle cues, the nervous tapping of a spoon, the averted eyes, the faint tremor in a hand reaching for toast. Every detail was a thread, and she was patient enough to follow each one until it revealed where it led. Inspector Neal arrived halfway through the meal, looking grimmer than before. The room fell silent as he entered, and even the clatter of cutlery ceased. He nodded briefly to Miss Marple, then addressed the family in his even, unhurried voice. "I've had reports from the laboratory," he said. "The same poison was used in all 3 deaths: Rex Fortescue, Adele Fortescue, and Gladys Martin. The method of delivery varied slightly, but not enough to suggest different hands. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing." A murmur rippled through the room. Adele's sister, pale and drawn, pressed a hand to her throat. Lancelot gave a short, harsh laugh that sounded more like disbelief than amusement. "So it's one of us, then," he said. "You've ruled out the servants, haven't you?" Neal's eyes flicked to him. "I haven't ruled out anyone yet." Brenda's fork clattered onto her plate. "That's absurd. Surely you can't think—" "Mrs. Fortescue," Neal interrupted, his tone calm but firm. 3 people are dead. Until I can account for everyone's movements, I'll think whatever the evidence requires me to think." The silence that followed was taut as wire. Only Miss Marple's soft voice broke it. "You'll find that people rarely act without reason, Inspector," she said mildly. "But reasons, like motives, are not always what they appear to be." He inclined his head toward her, acknowledging her point, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of weary amusement. "I suppose you have a theory already, Miss Marple?" She smiled faintly. "A suspicion, perhaps. A very small one. But suspicions, like seeds, can grow in time if properly tended." After breakfast, Miss Marple took a slow walk through the garden with Inspector Neal beside her. The morning air was cool and sharp, the sky a pale washed blue. The roses were beginning to fade, their petals falling one by one onto the damp earth. "Do you really think we're dealing with one person?" he asked after a while. 3 murders, all so carefully timed it feels almost too deliberate." "Oh, deliberate, yes," Miss Marple said. "But not too much so. The murderer has been careful to weave a pattern, but patterns, when repeated, begin to reveal their design. This nursery rhyme, for instance, sing a song of sixpence. It's a strange choice, don't you think? Not merely symbolic, but almost playful." "Playful?" Neal repeated. "Yes, a rhyme from childhood, something innocent turned grotesque. It's vanity, Inspector, a desire to make the horror memorable. Ordinary murderers conceal their crimes. This one performs them." He gave a grim smile. "You make it sound theatrical. In a way it is. The stage is this house, the audience us, and the murderer believes they are writing the ending. Neil stopped walking. You said something yesterday about pride. I did. And you think that's the key? Miss Marple turned her gaze toward the house, her expression unreadable. I think it's the one thing clever people never see in themselves until it's far too late. Inside, the atmosphere was changing. The servants whispered in corners, uneasy under the weight of suspicion. In the drawing room, Brenda sat with a letter in her lap, staring at it as though it might vanish if she looked away. When Miss Marple entered, the young woman startled slightly, then forced a smile. Miss Marple, she said. You always seem to appear at just the right moment. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. That's merely the illusion of age, my dear. We seem wise simply because we've had longer to listen. Brenda hesitated, then handed her the letter. It came this morning, from my brother. He says he's been questioned again about Father's money, about old business deals. The police think someone had been blackmailing him before he died. Miss Marple unfolded the letter carefully. The writing was hurried, anxious. They're asking about the African investments. Someone's been spreading stories. If they dig too deeply, they'll find everything. She looked up, meeting Brenda's eyes. Your father mentioned money in a letter I found last night. He said he wouldn't be ruined for someone else's vanity. Brenda blinked. Vanity, what did he mean? That, Miss Marple said softly, is what I'm trying to find out. The day passed in a kind of uneasy stillness. By afternoon, the clouds had rolled in and a fine drizzle began to fall. Miss Marple spent the time in the library, pretending to read but watching the comings and goings of the household reflected in the rain-dimmed window. Each person moved with the self-consciousness of someone aware of being observed. Shortly before dinner, Inspector Neal returned from town with a small envelope in his hand. Results from the chemist, he said quietly to Miss Marple when he found her alone. Traces of cyanide were found in the sugar bowl from the breakfast tray brought to Gladys. The maid didn't poison herself. I never thought she had, Miss Marple said. But the sugar bowl, you say? That's very clever. A shared object easily overlooked. Anyone could have tampered with it. Exactly, and everyone had access to the kitchen. Miss Marple considered this, then said, unless the person who placed it there wanted us to think precisely that. Neil frowned. You mean it was meant to confuse us? She smiled gently. Or to distract us from something much simpler. Murderers often make the mistake of being too elaborate. He sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. Sometimes I think you enjoy this. Not at all, she said, her voice softening. I simply dislike seeing wickedness win. Dinner that night was a strained affair. Conversation was forced, laughter brittle. The candlelight flickered over pale faces, over hands that fidgeted or clenched in silence. When the meal was over, Miss Marple excused herself early, claiming fatigue, though in truth her mind was sharper than ever. Upstairs, she paused outside one of the bedrooms, listening. Inside, she could hear the low murmur of two voices, a man's and a woman's. The words were indistinct, but the tone was urgent, fearful. She caught one phrase clearly before the door closed fully again. If she finds out, it's all over. Miss Marple's expression did not change, but her heartbeat quickened. She turned away quietly, descending the back staircase instead of the main one. If they feared discovery, then discovery was closer than they realized. The drizzle had turned to steady rain by the time she reached the conservatory. The glass panes rattled softly in the wind, and the scent of damp earth rose from the potted plants. She stood there for a long while thinking, her mind weaving the threads together. The letter, the midnight visit, the poisoned sugar, the scent of violets. All the pieces were there, only the order remained to be set. At last she smiled faintly to herself, the kind of smile that came not from satisfaction, but from understanding. The pattern was complete. All that remained was to wait for the murderer to show their pride one last time. The rain had not stopped by morning. It came down in fine whispering threads, veiling the garden in a silvery mist. The yew hedges, dark and dripping, stood like sentinels around the house. The world outside Yew Tree Lodge seemed to have retreated into shadow, as though it too wished to keep its distance from the evil that had taken root within those walls. Miss Marple was already awake when the first bell rang for breakfast. Sleep had come in short, restless bursts, interrupted by thoughts that refused to quiet. The image of the torn letter still hovered in her mind, as did the faint, clinging scent of violets that she could not forget. She rose, dressed, and sat for a moment by the window. watching the rain bead and trickle down the glass. Each droplet caught the pale light like small fleeting truths, visible for a second before disappearing into the blur. When she descended the staircase, the house felt different, not merely subdued but expectant. The servants moved with subdued urgency, whispering in corners. Somewhere a clock chimed faintly, and the sound echoed through the hall with unsettling precision. Inspector Neal was already in the dining room, a newspaper spread before him. He looked up as she entered, giving her a slight nod. "Morning, Miss Marple. You're up early." "One tends to be at my age," she said with a faint smile. "Sleep becomes more of a luxury than a necessity." He gestured for her to sit. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, one about pride. There's something in that. Someone in this house believes themselves cleverer than the rest of us." "They usually do," she replied, "until they are forced to realize how mistaken they've been." He folded the paper carefully. "There's a development. The post-mortem on Adele Fortescue came back. The poison was administered in her morning tea, but not directly in her cup. It was in the honey." "The honey?" Miss Marple repeated softly. "How very fitting," Neal frowned. "Fitting?" "The king was in his counting house counting out his money," she quoted gently. "And the queen was in the parlor eating bread and honey." Another verse from the rhyme. "The murderer hasn't finished playing yet," he exhaled sharply. "Then we have to stop the next verse before it happens." Miss Marple's eyes softened with that quiet, knowing sadness that seemed to belong only to her. "Oh, Inspector, I fear the rhyme may need to finish itself before it can be stopped. Murderers rarely surrender before the final act." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Lancelot, looking drawn and irritable. His collar was unbuttoned, his hair disheveled. He poured himself coffee with shaking hands. "I hope you're nearly done with this investigation, Inspector," he said. "The whole thing's turning into a circus. The press are sniffing around and half the servants are threatening to quit." Neal's expression did not change. "It would help if the truth were easier to come by." "Truth?" Lancelot gave a short laugh. "You're looking for truth in the wrong place. My father's business was a swamp. He made enemies in every direction. If you want your murderer, start there." Miss Marple looked at him thoughtfully. "Perhaps," she said mildly. "But the kind of poison used here, cyanide mixed with household items, suggests someone who had time, access, and a certain domestic familiarity. That doesn't sound like an old business rival to me." He glanced at her, irritation flickering briefly in his eyes. "You think one of us did it, then?" "I think," Miss Marple said, "that the person who did it felt quite at home here." For a moment no one spoke. The only sound was the faint tick of the clock on the mantelpiece. Lancelot pushed back his chair sharply and left the room without another word. After he was gone, Neal murmured, "He's hiding something." "Of course he is," Miss Marple replied. "They all are, but only one of them hides murder." Later that morning, Miss Marple wandered into the study again. The rain had slackened to a fine drizzle, and light filtered through the heavy curtains. She stood by the desk where Rex Fortescue had once worked, her gaze resting on the neat rows of ledgers, the polished brass paperweight, the small photograph of a younger woman smiling faintly. His first wife, she suspected. There was something about the photograph that tugged at her attention. She bent closer, studying the frame. It had been moved recently. Faint dust lines marked its old position. She lifted it gently and found, tucked behind the cardboard backing, a folded sheet of paper. Her pulse quickened slightly as she unfolded it. It was another letter, written in the same impatient scrawl she had seen before. The ink was faded, the tone angry, defensive. "You've no right to interfere. The money was mine by agreement. You'll regret this if you try to undo it." There was no signature, only initials, MD. She read it twice, frowning slightly. MD. The initials meant nothing at first, but she tucked the letter into her sleeve before replacing the photograph exactly as she had found it. When she stepped into the corridor again, she found Inspector Neal waiting. His face was grave. Another message from the lab. They found traces of arsenic in one of the brandy decanters in the pantry. "Someone's been poisoning the supply." Miss Marple's brow furrowed. "Arsenic? That's not the same as the cyanide used before." "No," he said, "which means someone's either getting sloppy or trying to make it look like there's more than one killer." She nodded slowly. "Or perhaps," she said, The murderer is ready for the rhyme's final verse. Neil stared at her. You mean the maid? The blackbird pecked off her nose. Miss Marple's voice was very quiet. No, Inspector. The rhyme does not end with the maid. It ends with the pie. When the pie was opened, the birds began to sing. The pie, Inspector. That will be the end. For a long moment, neither spoke. The rain tapped softly against the window pane, as steady as a heartbeat. Then Neil said, You think the next death will happen at a meal? I do, she said. And I think the murderer has already decided when. That evening, the household gathered reluctantly in the dining room once more. The table gleamed under the light of the chandelier, the silver polished, the food arranged with careful elegance. Conversation was forced, strained. Even the servants moved uneasily, aware that the atmosphere had thickened into something close to dread. Miss Marple took her seat quietly, her eyes watchful. She noticed every small movement, a hand lingering too long near a dish, a glance exchanged across the table, a nervous flicker of the eyes toward the door. When the dessert arrived, her gaze sharpened. It was a large, beautifully glazed pie, golden and fragrant. The cook announced it proudly. A family recipe, she said, one Mrs. Fortescue had always insisted on for special occasions. Miss Marple's heart gave a single, heavy beat. The rhyme's final verse, the pie. She looked at Inspector Neil, seated across from her. Their eyes met for an instant, and in that silent glance, understanding passed between them. The trap was ready to spring. But whether it would catch the murderer or another innocent soul, only the next few moments would tell. For a moment, no one moved. The golden brown pie gleamed in the center of the table like a crown set upon a velvet cushion, its crust shining faintly under the chandelier's glow. A sweet spice scent drifted through the air, warm and strangely comforting, at odds with the taut silence that gripped the room. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on it, the way the steam curled upward, the small decorative slits on the surface like tiny eyes watching. Across from her, Inspector Neil's gaze was steady but tense. The maid hesitated at the sideboard, knife poised, waiting for a signal. Go on, said Jennifer Fortescue, her voice brittle. Serve it before it gets cold. The maid nodded and began to slice. The knife slid through the crust with a crisp sound, releasing a puff of fragrant air. Plates were passed, spoons set down. Every movement felt deliberate, as though each person were performing a ritual whose meaning they did not fully understand. Miss Marple did not touch her plate. She merely watched, the faint tremor in Elaine's hand as she lifted her fork, the forced brightness of Lancelot's voice as he tried to fill the silence. Well, he said with a strained laugh, at least the cook hasn't lost her touch. His words fell flat. Only the faint scrape of cutlery answered him. Then a sound, when small but enough to break the brittle composure of the room. A cough, then another. Jennifer's face went pale. She clutched at her throat, her eyes wide with sudden terror. The fork clattered from her hand as she gasped, fingers trembling violently. Jennifer! Elaine cried, half rising. But before anyone could move, Neil was already there, grabbing her wrist, pulling the plate away. Don't eat, he barked. No one else touches it. The maid froze, the serving spoon still raised. The others stared in disbelief as Jennifer slumped back in her chair, breathing in short, ragged gasps. Miss Marple rose slowly. Inspector, she said softly. It's happening again. He knelt beside Jennifer, checking her pulse. She's alive, and for now. Get the doctor, hurry. Elaine ran from the room, her steps echoing through the hall. Miss Marple moved closer, studying the plate before her. A faint bitter smell rose from the filling. Almonds. Cyanide again, she murmured. Neil looked up sharply. But how? We controlled the kitchen. Nothing was left unattended. Her eyes flickered toward the maid, who stood pale and shaking near the door. Perhaps not in the kitchen, Inspector. But the serving, that was another matter entirely. The maid burst into tears. I swear I didn't do anything, ma'am. I just brought it in, just like Cook told me. Where is Cook now? Neil demanded. In the scullery, sir. She said she'd fetch the custard. He was gone before she finished. Miss Marple remained where she was, her expression unreadable, her eyes drifting over the table, the untouched plates, the faint traces of steam still curling from the pie. She leaned forward and gently lifted the crust from Jennifer's plate with the tip of her knife. Beneath it, she saw something strange, a faint glimmer of powdery residue unevenly spread, as though someone had sprinkled it hastily after serving. Her brows knitted. That meant the poison had been added after the pie was cut, not before. Which meant her gaze shifted to the only person who had touched Jennifer's plate after serving, Elaine. The young woman had returned to the room, her cheeks flushed, eyes wide with fear. "The doctor's coming," she said breathlessly. "Is she?" "She's alive," Miss Marple said gently. "But tell me, my dear, when you passed Jennifer her plate, did you notice anything unusual?" Elaine blinked. "No, nothing. I just wanted her to eat something. She looked so pale." Her voice broke off, and Miss Marple caught it, that flicker of guilt, gone almost before it appeared. Before she could speak again, Neil returned, his face grim. "Cook's gone," he said. "Vanished." Back door open, footprints leading into the garden. She took her coat but left her purse. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Gone, you say? Or made to go? She's the only one who could have poisoned the pie," Neil snapped. "We had guards posted. No one else touched it." Miss Marple shook her head slowly. "Oh, I wouldn't be too sure of that. If this murderer is who I believe they are, Inspector, they would never rely on a servant to finish their rhyme." Jennifer moaned faintly. Her eyelids fluttered and her lips moved. Miss Marple leaned close, hearing only fragments. "The papers. Drawer, she knows." Then she fell silent again. Miss Marple straightened. She was trying to say something important. About the papers in the drawer, perhaps the same ones Rex Fortescue tried to hide. Neil rubbed his temples. "Every time we think we're closing in, it slips away. If Cook's innocent, we're back to square one." Miss Marple's voice was calm, but her eyes gleamed with a quiet certainty. "Not quite, Inspector. The rhyme has nearly finished itself. There can be only one verse left, and one person who benefits from them all." Neil looked at her sharply. "You've worked it out?" "Not yet," she said softly. "But I will, and very soon." The doctor arrived moments later, his black bag glinting as he entered. After examining Jennifer, he looked up. "She'll live," he said. "It was a small dose, not enough to kill outright, thank heaven." Neil nodded. "Good, keep her under guard. No one visits her except Miss Marple and myself." As the others dispersed, shaken, murmuring, Miss Marple lingered near the window. The rain had stopped, and through the thinning mist she could see the faint outline of the yew trees black against the pale grass. The footprints Neil had mentioned were already fading into mud. She turned away and whispered under her breath, "The birds begin to sing." That night, the house was quieter than it had ever been. Fear had taken hold completely, the kind that silences even the most talkative. Servants moved in hushed steps. The family locked their doors. Only one light still burned, in the small sitting room where Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting resting in her lap, her mind turning over every fragment, every pattern, every verse somewhere. A clock struck 11, and in that stillness Miss Marple knew she was close, closer than she had ever been, because the rhyme had one line left. And the murderer, she was certain, was preparing for the final act. The fire had burned low, its embers pulsing faintly in the grate, casting soft shadows that trembled across the walls. Miss Marple sat motionless, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes fixed on the dying flame. Every creak of the house, every whisper of the wind beyond the window seemed charged with meaning. Somewhere upstairs a door closed softly. Someone was awake. She had not expected to sleep that night. The storm outside had faded into a soft drizzle, leaving the air heavy and still. The faint scent of wet earth and lilac drifted through the slightly open window, mingling with the faint tang of smoke from the hearth. Miss Marple's gaze moved slowly toward the table by her chair. There beside her knitting lay the torn fragment of paper she had found behind the photograph, M.D. The initials circled in her mind like restless birds, Mary Dove. She said the name aloud, very quietly as though tasting it, the housekeeper. Calm, efficient, well-spoken. The kind of woman who could be trusted to run any household with clockwork precision. Too perfect, Miss Marple thought now. Too smooth, too self-contained. Her instincts prickled. A woman like that did not vanish into service out of nowhere. She had a past, and pasts in Miss Marple's experience rarely stayed buried. The clock on the mantel chimed 11:30. Miss Marple rose, gathering her shawl around her shoulders. Her movements were deliberate, almost soundless. She slipped from the sitting room into the hall where the lamps had been turned low. The air was cool and her footsteps whispered against the rug. From above came a faint sound, movement on the landing. She paused, listening. Then carefully she began to climb. The upper corridor was dark except for a thin strip of light spilling from beneath a door halfway down. She recognized it instantly. The housekeeper's room. For a long moment she stood there watching the line of light, hearing the faint rustle of paper within. Then, without hesitation, she raised her hand and knocked. There was a pause. Then Mary Dove's calm, composed voice. "Yes, who is it?" "Miss Marple," she replied pleasantly. "I'm so sorry to disturb you, but I wonder if I might have a word." A brief silence followed. Then the door opened and Mary stood there, her dressing gown neatly tied, her expression composed but faintly strained. "Of course," she said. "Come in." The room was tidy, almost unnaturally so. A small desk with neatly stacked papers, a bed turned down with military precision, not a thing out of place. A faint scent of lavender hung in the air. Miss Marple sat down near the small fire, her eyes roving quietly over the room. "You've had a most difficult few days," she said kindly. "These tragedies take such a toll on everyone." Mary inclined her head. "Yes, it's been dreadful. Poor Mrs. Fortescue. And now Miss Jennifer. I can't imagine what's become of this house." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, I think you can imagine a great deal, my dear." Mary's eyes flickered, just once, but she recovered quickly. "I beg your pardon?" "Imagination," Miss Marple said softly, "is a rare and useful thing, especially for someone clever enough to play a nursery rhyme to its bitter end." There was a long silence. The ticking of the small clock on Mary's desk sounded very loud in the stillness. "I don't know what you mean," Mary said at last. "Oh, but I think you do," Miss Marple replied gently. "You see, I've been thinking about the rhyme, about the sequence. The first verse, and the king poisoned with his morning cup. The second, the queen, her honey tainted. The maid strangled in the garden. And finally the pie, the feast meant to end it all. Each act connected, deliberate. Not random as we first believed. And at the center of it all, someone who knew exactly how this household worked, who could move unseen, unheard. Someone like you." Mary's face remained composed, but a flicker of tension tightened her jaw. "That's absurd," she said quietly. "I was loyal to Mr. Fortescue. I ran this house efficiently." "Ask anyone." "Oh, I shall," Miss Marple murmured. "But loyalty, I've found, is a curious thing. It often hides its true object. You see, I found a letter, written in your hand, I believe, tucked behind a photograph on Mr. Fortescue's desk. It seems there was an arrangement once. Money, promises, and anger when those promises were broken." Mary's composure faltered. Her lips parted, but no words came. "You were once connected to someone named Mackenzie, were you not?" Miss Marple continued quietly. "The man whose fortune your employer cheated him of years ago? You were his daughter, Mary Dove, and formerly Mary Mackenzie." A shadow crossed Mary's face, and for the first time her calm slipped. "You've done your homework," she said. "I suppose I shouldn't be surprised." Miss Marple's expression was almost sympathetic. "Revenge, my dear, rarely brings peace. I know you thought to balance the scales, to avenge your father's ruin, but 3 deaths cannot right an old wrong." Mary laughed softly, a sound as brittle as glass. "Do you think this was about money? About justice? He destroyed more than my father's business. He destroyed him, and then he married again, lived richly, smugly, while we starved. I swore he'd pay, and he did." Her eyes glinted in the firelight. "Every rhyme, every verse, and it was for him. The king in his counting house, the queen with her honey. Even that foolish maid, she overheard too much. And Jennifer," her voice trailed off, cold and flat. "She deserved to taste what the rest of us did." Miss Marple's hands were steady on her lap. "And the pie?" she asked quietly. Mary smiled faintly. A flourish. "Every story needs an ending." The sound of footsteps in the corridor made her turn. The door opened and Inspector Neal stepped in, his expression grim. "That's quite enough, Miss Dove. I heard every word." Mary's expression hardened. "You tricked me." Miss Marple rose slowly. "Not tricked, my dear. Merely given the chance to finish your story." For a moment no one spoke. Then Mary's gaze shifted to the window. The rain had begun again, a cold, steady whisper against the glass. She took a step toward it as though drawn by something beyond the room. "Don't," Neely warned sharply. But she only smiled, that same calm, measured smile she had worn every day in that house. "It's over, Inspector. The rhyme's done. She turned back once, her face oddly peaceful. When the pie was opened, she said softly. The birds began to sing, and then, with one swift motion, she opened the small bottle she had concealed in her sleeve, the same bitter almond scent filling the air before anyone could move. Miss Marple gasped. "No." Mary swayed, the bottle slipping from her fingers. Neil caught her as she fell, but it was too late. The poison had done its work swiftly, as it had so many times before. She died without another word. For a long time, the only sound was the rain, whispering against the window like the soft wings of unseen birds.